Hello and welcome to the Sysadmin Tutorials YouTube channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the installation of the vCenter 6.7 server appliance. This video follows on from my previous video of how to install and configure VMware ESXi 6.7. With that being said, let's jump straight in. First up, we need to prepare our DNS for the installation. So I'll head on over to my Active Directory server and create a DNS record for my VCSA server. Before we create the host record, make sure that you have a reverse lookup zone created. My reverse lookup zone for my subnet is this one here, 1.168.192.in-addr.arpa. If you don't have a reverse lookup zone, you can simply right click on reverse lookup zone and select new zone, next, primary zone. You can store it in Active Directory. And you can replicate to all DNS servers running on domain controllers in this domain. It's an IPv4 reverse lookup zone. And in here we simply type in our subnet. We click next, only allow secure dynamic updates, and finish. I'm not going to click on finish because I already have this zone created. So I'll just click cancel here. Now I'll select my DNS name. I'll right click on it and select new host. The host name I'll create will be VCSA 6.7 and I'll give it an IP address of 192.168.1.69. Once you've entered in all the fields, ensure that you have create associated pointer record selected, and that will ensure our host is able to be resolved in a reverse lookup. We'll click on add host. The host being added successfully. Click done. Now I'll head back to my management server where I have previously downloaded the VCSA 6.7 ISO file from VMware. This is my ISO file here. However, if you've not downloaded an ISO file before from VMware, you can head on over to myvmware.com, click on View and Download Products. That will take you to the My Products page. You can then select All Products, which will take you to this page. We can go down to VMware vSphere, View Download Components. Scroll down until you see VMware vCenter 6.7 and we'll click Go to Downloads. Within the downloads, you can see here our VMware vCenter Server Appliance. So we'll click on Download Now and just go through the prompts there and just save it to a location on your server. So I've saved mine in the E drive, temp folder, and VCSA 6.7 folder. Next up, we're going to right click on the ISO file and we're going to select Mount. We're going to go into the folder called VCSA UI Installer, then into Win32, and we'll right click on installer.exe and select Run as Administrator. The installer gives us 4 options to choose from. For this video, we'll be clicking on Install. The installer is broken up into 2 stages. So stage 1 is deploying the actual virtual appliance itself. And then stage 2 is going through the appliance setup. So we'll begin with stage 1 here and we'll click next. We'll accept the license agreement. Here we have 2 installation scenarios. Either we can combine the platform services controller and vCenter into the one server, or we can separate the functions and have one server for the platform services controller and one server for the vCenter server. If you're not sure what a platform services controller is, it was introduced in vSphere 6 and combines the security functions such as SSO, licensing, certificates, and server reservation. A PSC consists of the following components: Appliance Management Service, License Servers, Component Manager, Identity Management Service, HTTP Reverse Proxy, Service Control Agent, Security Token Service, Common Logging Service, Syslog Health Service, Authentication Framework, Certificate Service, and Directory Service. For our installation, we're going to be using the Embedded Platform Services Controller option. And so we've got that selected there. We'll click Next. Within this lab environment, I already have a vCenter server and 3 ESXi hosts set up. I will be installing this vCenter server as another VM within that environment. On this screen, it is asking for either my vCenter server name or ESXi host name. I'll now provide my underlying vCenter server host name along with its credentials. Once that information is typed in, I'll click on Next. A certificate warning pop-up is displayed, and this is for the certificate of your vCenter server. I'm going to click on Yes to accept this certificate. Within this window, I'm simply looking for a VM folder to install my vCenter VM into. So I'll expand my data center here, and I'm going to be installing it into a folder I created earlier called VMware 67 Lab. I'll make sure that's selected and I'll click on Next. Within my underlying vSphere environment, you can see I've got the data center name called VM Lab. My cluster name is VM Lab Cluster. And if I expand that, you can see my 3 ESXi hosts. I'm going to be just selecting the VM Lab cluster, and I'll let vSphere work out which host to deploy the VM on. So I'll just make sure that's highlighted and I'll click on Next. In this window, I'll be specifying the virtual machine name for my vCenter server. So that's simply going to be VCSA 67. Next, I'm going to specify the root password. And once that's done, we can click on Next. For the deployment size, we can reference the table here to determine what deployment size we should be setting for our vCenter server. For a lab environment, I'm going to be selecting Tiny, as I won't have more than 10 hosts or any more than 100 virtual machines within this environment. However, you can reference the number of hosts and virtual machines you'll have in your environment and specify what deployment size you wish to configure. Lastly, if we want to specify a larger storage size for the vCenter database, you can drop down this menu and select Default, Large or Extra Large. Changing the storage size also updates the storage column in the table below. For our deployment, I'm going to be selecting Default, and we'll click on Next. Listed here are the data stores available in my underlying vSphere environment. The data store that I'll be installing our VCSA server into is called Synology 1815 NFS1. And we'll click Next. Within the Configured Network Settings window, I will select the underlying network I wish to connect my VCSA server to. In this case, it is called Home Lab Internal. The IP version I'll leave as IPv4. IP assignment is set on static, which is what we want. For the FQDN or fully qualified domain name, I'll enter in my VCSA host name with my Active Directory DNS name appended to it. So the FQDN will look like this: vcsa67.vmlab.local. The VCSA installer will query your Active Directory DNS for this hostname and also try to perform a reverse DNS lookup on the IP address so that the host name matches the IP address. Hence why we added the host name to our Active Directory DNS previously. Next, I'll enter in the IP address. In this case, it's 192.168.1.69. Next, we'll enter in our subnet mask, followed by our default gateway. And lastly, we'll enter in here our DNS servers. In my case, my DNS server is 192.168.1.101. If you have multiple DNS servers, you can just separate them with a comma. We'll leave the common ports set as default, port 80 for HTTP and port 443 for HTTPS. And we'll click on Next. The last window here for stage 1 deployment is a summary of all our settings that we have previously entered or selected. Double check that everything is correct. If you need to make any changes, you can click on the back button. If all the settings are correct, click on Finish to start the stage 1 deployment. Our stage 1 deployment is now complete. You can click on Close and continue the deployment later on by going to this URL, https://vcsa67.vmlab.local:5480. We will continue on to stage 2 deployment by clicking on Continue. We can see that stage 1 deployment is complete and successful by this tick here. We are now going on to stage 2, So we'll click on Next. For time synchronization, we have two options. We can synchronize the time with the ESXi host, or we can specify an NTP server. I'm going to specify an NTP server, so I'll select Synchronize Time with NTP servers. And my NTP server is going to be my Active Directory domain controller, which is the PDC. And the IP address for that is 192.168.1.101. And here we have the option to allow SSH access to the vCenter Server Appliance. By default, it's on disabled. I'm going to select enabled on this one, and we'll click Next. In this window, we will create our single sign-on domain name. By default, it is vSphere.local. However, you can change this to suit your needs. I'll be using the default of vSphere.local. I'll then enter our single sign-on password for the administrator account. If you already have a Platform Services Controller deployed, that means you have an existing SSO domain. By clicking on this option here, you can join an existing SSO domain. This could be used if you have external PSCs deployed or you are setting up vCenter linked mode. I will just show you the options on join an existing SSO domain. In this first field, you enter in the fully qualified domain name or IP address of your existing Platform Services Controller, the HTTPS port, by default 443, the single sign-on domain name, so by default vSphere.local or whatever it is existing in your Platform Services Controller, and then followed by the administrator password. I'll click back on Create a new SSO domain, and we'll click Next. I'm going to untick Join the VMware's Customer Experience program for this lab, and we'll click Next. In this window, we see a summary of our settings. Similar to in stage 1, if we need to go back and change anything, we just simply click on the back button. If we're happy with all these settings, we'll click on Finish to complete stage 2 setup. A warning is displayed, highlighting that you will not be able to pause or stop the install for completing once it's started. We'll click OK to continue. However, you do have the option to click Cancel to stop the install. Stage 2 is now complete. As we can see here on the screen, our Getting Started page is located at https://vcsa67.vmlab.local, port 443. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to head on over to this page. We'll click Close, open up Chrome, and browse to this location. We'll click on Advanced, and we'll click Proceed to vcsa67.vmlab.local. And here we're presented with our Getting Started page. Before jumping into the vCenter web interface, we will take a look at the appliance user interface. To get to the appliance user interface, we type out our URL and append port 5480, just like this. To log in, we'll be using our root username and password. This is the password that we created during the VCSA setup, and we'll click Login. Here we have the new HTML5 appliance web interface. Personally, I think the HTML5 interface looks great, but also the user experience is much faster than the previous and older Flash interface. On the summary screen, we can see the health status of the appliance, as well as our single sign-on domain and our SSO status. Let's click on Monitor on the left-hand side. Within Monitor, we can see performance charts of CPU, memory, disks, network, and lastly, database space utilization. Once the server gathers enough information, we can even look back in time from the last hour, last day, week, month, quarter, and year. If we hover the mouse over certain sections of the graph, we'll be able to see the values at that point in time. Now we'll click on Access. We have 4 access settings that we can change here. The SSH login, which basically allows us to SSH to the appliance with PuTTY, for example. The Direct Console user interface, we can enable and disable this. The Direct Console user interface is this here. So this is just a console window or remote console window to the VCSA appliance itself. We have the console CLI, can enable or disable that. To access the console CLI, we open up the console and we press Alt F1. This is the console CLI. To get back to the GUI interface, we press Alt F2. And lastly, we have the bash shell here. The bash shell gives us access to the underlying operating system, and we can just type in our everyday Linux commands there. We'll move on to networking. As you can see in the networking section here, we have all our information that we specified during the VCSA setup, such as our DNS server, IP address, default gateway. We can edit that at any time by clicking Edit up at the top right-hand corner. And we can also make changes to our proxy settings here if we require a proxy to get out to the internet. And we'll do that by clicking Edit on the right-hand side here. Let's click on Time. We have two sections here, our time zone and our time synchronization. Under the time synchronization, if you remember, we set up our IP address as an NTP server during the VCSA setup. The only change I'm going to be making here is the actual time zone itself. So I'm going to be changing that by clicking on Edit. And I'll drop down the menu and I'm going to be selecting my time zone. Australia, Sydney. I'll click on Save and we'll move on to services. Here are a list of services contained within the vCenter Server Appliance. You can see some of the startup types are set to automatic or manual and even disabled down here. We can see the health status and then we can see the state, whether they're started or stopped. To make a change to a service, we can simply select it here and we can click on Restart or Stop. Since this service is already running, we do not get the option to start it. But if I click on a service that has not been started, we then have the option to start that. Let's now click on Update. Within Update, we can see our current version. So 6.7.0.14000. And if I want to check if there's any available updates, I can simply click on Check Updates. And we have two options. We can either check from a CD-ROM that we've inserted into the machine itself, or we can check from CD-ROM plus a URL. So checking from the URL, we'll go out to the internet, to the VMware site, and check to see if there's any available updates. Once the update's listed here, we can then click on Stage Only or Stage and Install. Let's click on Settings. We can select to check for updates automatically. So I'm going to turn that on. I'll leave it on every day at 12 AM. And the repository that I'll be using is from this VMware site. And once it queries against this repository, it will then let us know if there's any updates available for our VCSA. The other option is to use a custom repository by clicking on Custom Repository here. I'll click on Save and we'll move on to administration. The first section of administration, we have our password requirements. Our password requirements must have at least 6 characters and should not be any of your previous 5 passwords. Clicking on Change up here, we have the option to change our existing root username and password. And in the next table, we have our password expiration settings, where we have password expires, the validity, an email for expiration warnings, and then when the password expires. If we click on Edit, we can set if the root username and password expires or not, how long until the password expires, so in this case it's 90 days. And then when it's getting close to 90 days, we can send an email warning out to an administrator to let them know to come back in and make a change to the password. As this is a lab, I'm going to be setting the password expires to no, and I'll click on Save. We'll jump into Syslog now. We can configure a Syslog server here by clicking on Configure. Enter in the server address, protocol, and port. And if you want to add a second one, we can just click on Add, and once again repeat the same process. If you're not using a Syslog server currently, I highly recommend using VMware's vRealize login site. It is very easy to set up and to use. If you've never used VMware's login site, I do have a complete install and configure video on my YouTube channel entitled vSphere 6.5, How to Install and Configure vRealize login site. For now, I'll click Cancel on here, and we'll head on over to Backup. As we can see at the top of the screen, the protocols supported for backup are FTPS, HTTPS, SCP, FTP, and HTTP. FileZilla FTP server is a free FTP server that you can use for your VCSA backups. To download FileZilla server, you can browse to filezilla-project.org and click on Download FileZilla server. Once we have our FTP server set up, we can then click on Configure. We type in our FTP server address here, the username and password for the FTP server. We can set a schedule to back up frequently. If we want to encrypt the backup, we can type an encryption password here. This password will be required when you perform a restore. We can either retain all backups or retain a specific number. If I type in 7 and my schedule is running daily, I will retain 1 week's worth of backups. And at the bottom here, it will give us an indication to how big our inventory and configuration is. In this case, it's 99 meg. And our stats, events, and tasks, which is 23 meg. So total combined with compression is 122 meg. And you can just click on create once you have all those fields entered, and that will create your backup schedule. If you just want to perform a once-off backup, you can click on backup now. And once again, enter in the same type of information, your FTP server, FTP username and password, a password if you wish to encrypt the backup, and then once again down the bottom here, you have a summary of your sizes, and then optionally you can type in a description for the backup. The last part of the appliance interface is the actions menu up here. If we click on that, we can reboot the appliance, shut it down, and in the event that we need to upload a support bundle for VMware support, we can click on create support bundle. Once we're done here, we can click on log out, and we can return back to our other tab, which is the getting started vCenter interface. And we have two options here. We can either launch the vSphere client in HTML5, or we can launch the older vSphere web client, which is the Flex client. We're going to click on launch the vSphere client HTML5. And for our username, we're going to be typing in administrator@vsphere.local along with its password. This was the account we created during the VCSA setup. So we'll enter that information here and we'll click on login. The HTML5 web interface has almost all the components that you need to configure your vCenter server. There are a few components which still need to be configured in the old Flex client. In saying that, we will predominantly use the HTML5 client. However, when needed, we will switch back to the Flex client. There are many settings within vCenter. First up, we will create our first data center object, followed by adding our first ESXi 6.7 host. Once that is done, I will show you some basic settings within vCenter to get you started. To create a data center object, we will click on hosts and clusters over here on the right. I'll then right-click my vCenter object and select New Data Center. I will call my data center VMLab Data Center 1 and click OK. Within our data center, we are going to add in our ESXi 6.7 host. This is the ESXi 6.7 host that we have installed in my previous video called How to Install and Configure VMware ESXi 6.7. Before adding in our ESXi 6.7 host, I want to make sure there is a DNS name set up within my DNS server. This will allow me to add the host as a DNS name rather than an IP address. To do this, I will switch over to my Active Directory server. I will right-click on the Active Directory domain and select New Host. Our host name for our ESXi host is ESXi 67-1. The IP address for our host name is 192.168.1.70. Make sure you have Create Associated Pointer Record selected. This will allow us to perform reverse lookups as well as forward lookups. And we'll click Add Host. And done. I'm going to switch back to my vCenter server now. To add in my host, I will right-click on the data center and select Add Host. I can now enter in my ESXi host name here as opposed to my IP address. Once you've done that, click Next. In the host connection details, we'll enter in our ESXi root username and password. The security alert is asking you to verify the ESXi 6.7 certificate. Click Yes to accept the certificate. On this window, we can see our ESXi 6.7 host information summary. We'll click Next. We will assign the evaluation license to our ESXi host. The evaluation license gives us 60 days of unlimited operation. After the 60 days, the ESXi host is disconnected from vCenter and some of the advanced license features will be disabled. We'll go ahead and click Next. To lock down and prevent unauthorized users from accessing our ESXi host, we can enable one of the two lockdown modes. The descriptions given on screen are quite basic. VMware have documented the exact behavior in a table that I'll bring up now. In the table displayed on screen now, we can see the difference between normal lockdown and strict lockdown settings. An important point to highlight here is that if we add a user into the DCUI.access advanced option, that user will continue to have access to the host, except in the case of strict lockdown mode, where the direct console user interface service is stopped. In that case, no user will have access until the service is manually started. Also take note of the ESXi shell and SSH service options. These come into effect only if the service is enabled. I will show you how to add users to the DCUI.access advanced settings once we have completed the add host wizard. I'll now switch back to our vCenter web interface. For this demonstration and also for my lab, I'm going to be leaving disabled selected. So with that, I'll click next. I don't have any VMs within the ESXi host. If I did, I could specify a location for them once the host is added to vCenter. So I'll click next. Here we have a summary of the settings specified to add our ESXi host to vCenter. If you need to make any changes, click on the back button. Otherwise, if you're happy with these settings, then click on finish. If we now expand our data center, we can see that our ESXi host has been added. Let's now take a look at the DCUI.access option in regards to the lockdown mode. I'll click on Configure, scroll down to Advanced System Settings. We'll click on Edit on the right-hand side here. And within the filter section, we'll type in DCUI.access. As we can see on screen, the root user is allowed access. Any other user that has been configured on the ESXi host can also be configured here. Separate multiple users with a comma. I'll click Cancel to get out of this section. Now that our ESXi host has been added to vCenter, we can configure our authentication. To do that, let's click on Menu at the top and select Administration. Once in the Administration menu, click on Configuration. And I'll then click on Active Directory Domain. I'll click on Join AD. And here I'll enter in my AD domain name. I'll leave organization unit as blank for now. And here I'll enter in an administrator username and password. Once we've done that, we'll click on Join. Once we've joined our Windows Active Directory domain, we'll need to reboot the appliance to apply the changes. We'll acknowledge the notification at the top here. To reboot the appliance, we'll switch over to the appliance web interface. I'll log in here with the root username and password. And within Summary, I'll head on over to Actions and select Reboot. I'll select Yes to reboot the system. Here I'm running a constant ping to see when the appliance reboots and comes back up again. Now that the appliance has rebooted, we'll switch over to our Active Directory server and have a look at the computer object. I'll right-click on my domain and select Refresh. Then go back to Computers, and we'll scroll down and we can see our VCSA 6.7 computer object. Now I'm going to switch back to the vCenter web interface. I'll log back in with administrator at vSphere.local. And we'll click on the menu and select Administration. Under Single Sign-On, I'm going to click on Configuration. And then I'll click on Identity Sources. Within Identity Sources, I'll select Add Identity Source. Here we'll want the first option to be Active Directory Windows Integrated. In the second field, we'll have our Windows Active Directory domain, which mine is vmlab.local. And because we've already joined this server to the Active Directory, we can just select Use Machine Account. Here I'll click OK. And now we have our Active Directory domain as an identity source. If I now go to Users and Computers, also under Single Sign-On, and click on Groups, Administrators. I can click on Add Members. And next to select a domain, I can drop that down and select vmlab.local, which is my Active Directory domain. In search, I can type in domain admins. I'll then click on domain admins. And the domain admins has been added to the single sign-on administrators group. So I'll click OK. Under access control, I can click on global permissions and also assign domain admins to a global administrator role. However, I want to show you a more granular way where we will add domain admins as an administrator to our vCenter server object. I'll click on Menu and select Hosts and Clusters. Next, I want to make sure that my vCenter server is selected up here. And then we'll click on Permissions. Within Permissions, I'm going to click on the plus symbol. And next to User, I'm going to drop down this menu and select my Active Directory domain vmlab.local. And in the search field, I'm going to type in domain admins. I'll click on domain admins, and we're going to assign the role administrator. You can assign different roles by selecting the drop-down menu and clicking one of these other roles. However, we're going to be selecting administrator, and we'll also click on propagate to children. Some of the children objects are going to be your data center object, clusters, hosts, folders, etc. I'll click on OK. So our domain admins group has been added here to the administrators of our vCenter server. Now we're going to log out as administrator at vSphere.local. And I'm going to log in as a user in the domain admins group of my Active Directory server. And that is administrator at vmlab.local. I'll click login. And as you can see at the top right hand corner here, I'm logged in as administrator at vmlab.local. I also have administrator rights on my single sign-on and also administrator rights on my vCenter server. Next up, I'm going to configure my vCenter server general settings. To do that, I'll select my vCenter object and select Configure. Remember how I said previously that some of the settings are not configurable within the HTML5 interface? Well, this is one of them. To configure these settings, I'll switch over to the Flex client. Within the Flex client, I have navigated to exactly the same area as in the HTML5 interface. So I'm on my vCenter server, Configure, and under Settings, I'm in General. However, now I have an Edit button at the top right-hand corner. With the statistics interval duration listed here, samples that are collected every 5 minutes are stored for 1 day. Samples that are collected every 30 minutes are stored for 1 week. Samples that are collected every 2 hours are stored for 1 month. And samples that are collected on 1 day are stored for 1 year. I'm going to put up a table which describes the statistics levels from 1 to 4. Basically, level 1 to 2 are long-term stats, meaning it does not monitor everything and therefore takes up the least amount of room in the vCenter database. Level 3 to 4 capture more performance information and therefore takes up more room in the database. As the 5-minute interval is only maintained for a day and the 30-minute interval is stored for a week, I usually set these to level 4. To set the statistics level, I can just left click here and select level 4. I'll also do the same for the 30-minute one. For the intervals of 2 hours, I'll set this to level 3, and intervals of 1 day, I'll set to level 2. You can then estimate the database space requirement that is needed by entering in the number of hosts and virtual machines within your environment. As an example, 2 physical hosts with 10 virtual machines will require an estimated space of 1.44 gigabytes. I'll now click on Database. The only thing you may want to change here is the task retention and event retention in days. I'll leave mine as the default of 30 days. Next, I'll click on Mail. Within Mail, I'll enter in my mail server relay address and an email address as the mail sender. The next setting I will look at is SNMP receivers. Enter in the URL or IP address of your SNMP server as well as your community string. That will be all the changes that we'll be making in the general settings. Now I'll click on OK to apply those settings. I'll now return back to the HTML5 web interface. I will log into the HTML5 interface again with my domain user. Let's head on over to the Datastore section. To do that, I'll click on Storage on the left-hand side, and we'll expand our data center. And here we have a data store called Datastore 1. This data store is the local data store on the ESXi host. And what we're going to do is rename the data store to the ESXi hostname _ local. The reason why I do this is so that when I add multiple ESXi hosts, they are all added with Datastore 1. And what you will see here is Datastore 1, Datastore 1 bracket 1, Datastore 1 bracket 2, etc. Renaming the data store will make administration a little easier later on. To rename the data store, I simply click on it and select Rename. I'll then type in my new data store name, ESXi 67-1 _ local, and I'll click OK. The next thing I'll do within this area is create a folder called Local Data Stores. I can then place all my local ESXi host data stores within this folder. To create a new folder, I'll simply right-click on my data center object, and I'll go down to New Folder and select New Storage Folder. I'll name this folder Local Data Stores and click OK. I'll then simply drag my data store ESXi 67-1 _ local into the Local Data Stores folder. Now we come to an exciting part of this lesson, and that is to create your first virtual machine. I'm going to create a folder to place my virtual machine in, and to do that, I'll click on Menu and then VMs and Templates. I'll right-click on my data center object, and then I'm going to select New VM and Template folder. I'm going to name this folder Servers and click OK. Now I'm going to head back to the menu and select Hosts and Clusters. Within Hosts and Clusters, I'm going to right-click on my data center object and select New Virtual Machine. We're going to be creating a new virtual machine, so make sure this first option is selected, and we'll click Next. I'm going to be naming my server Server 2016-1. I'm then going to expand the data center object and select my servers folder that I created earlier. I'll then click Next. The only compute resource that we have available at the moment is one ESXi host, so just make sure that's selected and we'll click on Next. For the storage and where we're going to be placing our virtual machine, the only option I have is our local data store on the ESXi host. So for now, we're going to be selecting that and clicking Next. For the compatibility level, I will be selecting ESXi 6.7 and later, as my entire environment is 6.7. You also have the option of selecting lower compatibility levels that are compatible with ESXi versions less than 6.7. I'll be clicking Next now. This server is going to be a Windows Server 2016, so I'll just make sure that my guest OS family is Windows, although notice that you do have other options there for Linux and other. And for the guest OS version, I'll drop down this and I'll select Windows 2016. Virtualization-based security is only available with Windows 2016 or Windows 10. So what does this do? Let me open a link to the article that explains what this setting does exactly. As you can see right here, VBS permits you to use the following Windows security features to harden your system and isolate key system and user secrets from being compromised, such as Credential Guard, aims to isolate and harden key system and user secrets against compromise. Device Guard provides a set of features designed to work together to prevent and eliminate malware from running on a Windows system. And lastly, Configurable Code Integrity ensures that only trusted code runs from the bootloader onwards. I'll switch back to my vSphere client. We'll leave this unticked for now, and I'll click Next. Now we get to configure the amount of resources we're going to give to the operating system. I will allocate one vCPU, 2 gigs of RAM, and a 30 gigabyte hard drive. I'll now expand the new hard disk section and change the disk provisioning to thin provisioned. This means that only the disk space that is needed will be consumed on disk. For example, I have configured 30 gigabytes, but if the Windows install only uses 20 gigabytes, then I will have only consumed 20 gigabytes on disk. If I select a thick provisioning option, I would have consumed 30 gigabytes on disk. The other option I'm going to change is under New Network, and the adapter type I'm going to select VMX-Net 3. The reason why I select VMX-Net 3 for my Windows server is due to this adapter being able to deliver the best performance. I'll then click on Next, and here we can review our VM settings. If you need to make any changes, just click on the back button, otherwise we'll go ahead and click Finish. If I now go and expand my ESXi host, we can see that our virtual machine has been created right here. What I'm going to do here is click on Launch Remote Console. If you've previously installed the remote console, it will launch straight away. However, you have the option to download the remote console .exe file by clicking on this link here. I've already previously installed the remote console, therefore it opens straight away. And now I'm going to click on the play button, and that's going to power on my virtual machine. Now to install Windows, I'm going to need to mount my ISO file. To mount the ISO file, I'm going to click on VMRC, go down to Removable Devices, CD DVD drive, and I'm going to connect to disk image file. Because the virtual machine couldn't find any boot drives, it's gone straight to the boot manager. This will happen automatically. And because we have our ISO file mounted, we can go down and select VMware Virtual SATA CD-ROM drive. And we'll just press enter. I'll press enter again to boot from the DVD. And as you can see, our Windows installer has begun. I'm now going to continue with a quick Windows 2016 server install that I will speed up in the video. Our virtual machine has now finished its installation. I'll set my administrator password and click Finish. I'll now log into my Windows virtual machine. The first thing we want to do here is install VMware tools. To do that, I'll click on the VMRC menu at the top left corner. I'll select Manage, and then click Install VMware Tools. I'll click on Select to choose what happens with this disk, and we'll select Run Setup64.exe. We'll run through the installation wizard. I'll select Typical Setup and Install. VMware Tools is now complete, so we'll click Finish, and we'll click Yes to restart our computer. Now that we have VMware Tools installed, we can log into the server and configure our IP addressing, host name, etc. I'll now close the VMware Remote Console. The last part that we're going to have a look at is the basic monitoring of our virtual machine. I'll click on Monitor, and under Performance, I'll click on Overview. Here we can see our CPU, memory, disk, and network statistics. We have the option to view these graphs in real time, last day, last week, last month, last year, or we can enter in a custom date range. I'm going to click back on the summary, and here we're going to wrap up our video. I hope you've enjoyed this video on installing VMware's vCenter Server Appliance 6.7. Based on previous feedback, I've tried to add more content into this video compared to my past vCenter videos, but still keep it relatively short at under 45 minutes. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on my latest videos. You can also subscribe to my Twitter feed @systutorials. If you have any comments or feedback, please leave them in the comment section below. Thank you everyone, and we'll see you in our next video.